Those two videos really show us different views of the city. One from a social activist who is on the ground creating change in her community and hopefully citywide, and then views of lots of different individuals, voices from people on the street talking about why they like cities and why the cities are exciting to them. So that's the human perspective. Those are the people who you're interacting with in your community on a regular basis. There are other stakeholders in this group, and if we look at the writing of someone like Manuel de Landa, we get a different view, that historical exploration of urban dynamics must include an analysis of the institutions that inhabit cities, whether they're bureaucracies that run them or the markets that animate them. The markets piece we're going to do next week. We're going to talk about sustainability from an enterprise and an economic perspective by looking at BMW, the author of that last video, very smart marketers, and we're actually going to take the role of marketers, and we're going to be marketers next week for BMW. But this week we're talking about bureaucracies and really trying to learn more about how government can work with people to create a more sustainable community, a more sustainable city. The vehicle that we've chosen for doing that is the Greenworks Philadelphia plan. There are about 160 different projects, what are called initiatives, underneath the umbrella of the Greenworks plan, and you can see a little bit down at the bottom here the different themes that they work with: energy, environment, equity, economy, and engagement. And this is a long-term plan. It was written in 2009. It's going to be completed in 2015, and the idea is to really lower energy use as much as possible, improve air quality, reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but then also to think very broadly about equity and how sustainability can contribute to the economy. So we're going to take a look specifically at the equity section of the Greenworks plan. But first we're going to look at really the whole set of targets here. And these are the 15 Greenworks targets, fall into the different categories that I just talked about: lowering city government energy use, reducing building energy consumption, making sure that houses are up to date in terms of insulation, air sealing, and cool roofs by weatherizing them and retrofitting them, purchasing electric energy from sustainable and renewable sources, reducing greenhouse gas emissions by 20%, improving air quality, diverting waste from landfills, managing stormwater, providing parks and recreation resources within 10 minutes of 75% of residents, so that most folks should be able to actually walk to a local park or some other kind of recreation resource, bringing local food into the community so that it's 10 minutes away from 75% of residents. Again, they can walk instead of drive to get local food, making sure that the tree canopy covers 30% of all of the neighborhoods. It's a little bit of a longer term goal to 2025. Reduce the amount of vehicle miles traveled, the amount of road miles traveled by cars, by 10%, increasing the state of good repair in resilient infrastructure, really beefing up all of the capital and physical assets that the city has, making sure that they're in good shape and are really a big part of the growth platform for the future. And the best way to do that is by repairing them and keeping them well maintained. Next one is doubling the number of low and high skill green jobs, making sure that everyone can participate in the green collar economy, and making sure finally that Philadelphia is the greenest city in America. Philadelphia's Mayor Nutter is in a competition with folks from Chicago and Los Angeles and other cities to be the greenest city. He's adamant that we in Philadelphia are actually going to be the ones who do that. So let's take a look at these dark blue targets here, 8, 9, and 10, to get a better idea of what's underneath them and what might create equity. And here is the first set, really related to stormwater management and greening up some of the pieces of infrastructure that are really private assets, but then also some of the infrastructure that are surface parking lots. So within this, we've got about 10 different initiatives for the equity portion in Target 8, and maintaining regulatory changes, making sure that there are costs associated with actually creating impervious surfaces so that people will have to pay for putting down impervious surfaces, or if they already have them, they'll have to pay for those. Those changes went into effect late in 2010 and are the subject of a lot of concern by business owners, but it's an important thing to be able to do, because if people don't pay for the stormwater runoff that they're creating, they're going to be paying later on for billions of dollars worth of infrastructure that's going to be necessary for treating all of that water before it returns to the waterways. Increasing the number of green roofs. Green roofs are the roofs that are planted with vegetation, so that instead of being either heat islands or heat reflectors, they're actually basically a piece of land that's up in the air, creating cleaner air, creating possibly a habitat, definitely being a place where green plants are located. So it's not just a good thing to do in terms of making a good roof, but it's also something that's as an addition to the green space that we've got, just in a slightly different way. Making sure that the streets are green is the next one. Creating model neighborhood demonstration projects where the streets are wider, where they're more like boulevards, but there are equal opportunities for the green spaces on the streets, so that they're less harsh. There isn't as much concrete and asphalt, but instead there is some sort of pervious surface, and water can drain through those surfaces down to the water table, take advantage of the cleansing aspects of the ground as the water takes the journey through down into the water table and into the rivers, so that they are cleaning as they go, and it doesn't need to be cleaned at a sewage treatment plant. But then also making the streets much more attractive looking, actually cooler on the ground because the tree canopy will be increased, and generally making them more accessible to both pedestrians as well as to cleaner modes of transport like bicycles. So that's the purpose of green streets. Transforming the vacant land, making sure that the lots that are currently being used for garbage, or that are just completely barren, or maybe just kind of torn down houses that are sitting on those lots, are taken care of, cleaned up, possibly remediated if they need to be, and then turned over to new owners. Creating wetlands wherever that's possible along the two great rivers that we have in the Delaware and the Schuylkill. Restoring existing waterways. We have a lot of different creeks that run through the city. Can those be turned over from polluted or really run down waterways and turned instead into really nice recreational areas? Doing green surface parking lots. There's a tremendous amount of paving that's been done in the city that is completely impervious, that everything basically washes anything on top of that surface over to the sewer, and then runs down into the water table and into into sewer, and then into the pipes into a facility for cleaning it up. And what gets taken with all of that water are the chemicals, like the lubricants or the fuels that might have fallen out of the bottoms of cars, anything else that's been put there during cleaning or other kinds of surface use, any of the different little bits of rubber that might have been coming off of tires. All of those things go into the water treatment plants and need to be cleaned up. And because the city is growing and the number of people is increasing, more and more you're seeing that these impervious surface plots are growing, and so the amount of water running into those is increasing as well. Couple that with climate change and the changes in precipitation, especially the sudden peak precipitations that folks are seeing more and more, where the storms are much more intense even though they aren't as frequent, and you're really overwhelming the system. And when the systems are overwhelmed, what the net problem there is that a lot of water may just get dumped over the side, that the treatment can't take place, and instead the water will be put directly into one of our rivers, possibly even put in down to the ocean as well. So those toxins really can and should be dealt with a lot earlier on by creating better parking spaces. There's a look also at rain barrels, controlling pollution trash on the rivers, making sure that things are fixed really before they're just pushed downstream, possibly to a dam, possibly to a treatment plant that really isn't designed to take large waste like that. Do more for stormwater at the city airport. A lot of fuel is being basically put out of the backs of the engines of these jets. The kinds of fumes that you smell if you're ever near an airplane actually collect on the surface of runways, collect on the surface of the impervious areas there, and when it rains, all washes right off into the sewers, creating the same kinds of problems that we've already been talking about. And then as the airport has grown, they've added a cell phone parking lot, so they're looking at putting an infiltration program for stormwater to clean up the stormwater there, because that's a nice new spot where you might be able to do some greenfield work as opposed to trying to turn over an existing impervious surface. And then, is there a way to develop a sustainable citywide stormwater management plan? One of the authors of this plan, a fellow named Bill Toffee, is a very passionate advocate of managing stormwater and is part of a whole network of organizations in the city who are working together to create a really solid stormwater management plan. So I'm going to go a little more quickly through Target 9, making sure that there are parks and recreation resources within 10 minutes of 75% of the residents, making sure that we've got money for open space developments, that you can prioritize that work, especially within lower served neighborhoods. This is something that's related to the Department of Planning, the comprehensive plan that's being put out by the planning folks is really looking at prioritizing green space, making sure that zoning takes into account the need for green space in underserved neighborhoods as much as possible, so that it's not just block after block of built housing, but instead some of those blocks can be broken up a little bit with pleasant green spaces that not only are good to visit, but increase the value of the homes in the neighborhood as well. Making sure that there are connected parklands and open spaces, another piece of the comprehensive plan, and then making sure that our Fairmount Park ecosystem is as stable as possible is another important initiative in here. Fairmount Park is an amazing asset within the city. It's the second largest city park that's wholly in the bounds of the city after the park in Chicago. It's larger in terms of acreage than even Central Park in New York City, and is just a fantastic place. Unfortunately, it doesn't take care of itself. It does need some help, so there needs to be some work done in that particular area to beef up all of the plant and animal life and making sure that they're as sustainable as possible. Next one is bringing local food in. This is a real effort on behalf of the city, spearheaded by a woman named Sarah Wu, who's doing a terrific job of managing all of these initiatives, expanding the number of farmers markets. Right now there are about 40 of those, and they should actually do better than their target in terms of that work pretty shortly. There are going to be 4 new farmers markets in public housing areas very soon, possibly within the next couple of months, by the middle of 2011. Making sure that people are aware of local food, helping people who are growing food bring it to market, using some of the vacant land that's in the city for urban agriculture, making sure that there are connections between the local farms and schools so that schools have fresh food and local farmers have a bigger customer base and a steadier customer base for selling their products, making sure as much as possible that there are commercial farms within the city in places like the Mantua farm, which is in the far western part of the city, encouraging distribution of healthy food in neighborhood stores, which is making sure that the corner store doesn't just carry a bunch of chips and soda, but instead has healthy options there. Whether they're local or not doesn't really necessarily matter, but just getting those stores, which is where a lot of people have to buy their food because there aren't any supermarkets nearby, actually have healthy options. Support the expansion of food co-ops, making sure that there are cooperative grocery stores and other smaller outlets for food in different neighborhoods, and that there are more of those. Creating an urban agriculture workforce strategy to grow green jobs. It's going to be done in the future, but it's related to the other green jobs that would be working in the target for economy, and then making sure that there is more work done between the enterprise community distribution centers for food and Philly Kitchen Share, and then other kitchens around the area, so that the kitchens which are serving needy people are as green as possible. And then the final one here is integrating anti-hunger efforts into food and agriculture goals, making sure that it's not just bringing in local food, but targeting it to the people who are most in need. Last one that we'll take a look at is the tree coverage, making sure that the tree rules are actually as much as possible, getting tree coverage, increasing the canopy so that there really are a lot more options and an easier way to get trees planted. The mayor's goal right now is to get 75,000 new trees planted, and we can only hope that that comes true. It would be an amazing addition to the city. It would be a huge green infrastructure that everyone would really be able to take advantage of for many years to come. So the question that all of that raises is, will Greenworks equity section actually do a significant amount to create equity in the city? And I'll leave you that question to think about, but it's difficult to create equity, especially when you're coming at it solely from sustainability and maybe not thinking as holistically. The plan really does try to think holistically, tries to think about how folks can get equity by lowering the cost of their energy, by greening up their homes so that they use less energy, then working with different kinds of people to find jobs, and also distributing the green infrastructure throughout the city in a more equitable way. But is it enough? That's really the question. And what else might be able to get done so that there's even a better equity environment throughout the city? So a project that I've been involved in is actually tracking the numbers related to all of the Greenworks activity. I'm going to take you over and we can take a look at that. This is the home page for that. It's greenworksdatabase.com, where you can go to .org, it doesn't matter. And then while you won't be able to log in directly, at some point soon we will open it up so that everyone can take a look at the different kinds of measures and metrics that are located in the database. You'll be able to go in there and run reports, drill into some of the data that's available, and really get to know how the plan is making an impact in the different areas of the city and according to the goals of the plan. So I just logged into the database itself to show you a couple of different things that are going on. In terms of tracking initiatives, these graphs show progress of different types of initiatives. I can actually get a better view of that for you. Go over here. These are some of the dashboards, just bigger views of those dashboards. One of the initiatives is getting the city employees to stop using cars owned, maintained, and fueled by the city and instead get them into car sharing programs. So this graph shows you how there are close to 500 people who have done that so far. This graph shows you how many homes have been weatherized. the goal in the plan is to get it up to 100,000. So far there have been only about 2,000 done, so there's a tremendous amount to be done there. But you can also see in this graph the two different organizations who are working on that and how well they're faring basically against one another. Even though it's really not a competitive activity, you can see who's doing what in any given month. And then over here, in terms of the recycling rebate program that gives you coupons for recycling, how many people have signed up for that in any given month. What you can do in all of these different graphs is actually click here, take a look at the underlying data. And again, this is something that anyone will be able to do pretty soon, but you can see in January of 2010 that 6,700 people enrolled in these plans, and then the next month, not quite so good, 3,700 enrolled then, and begin to get a much better sense of how this works and the mechanics of it and what's really going on in a very transparent way, in a way that typically you wouldn't see if you were to look at a strategic plan for another kind of organization within a city, even in a state or a federal government agency. So data will be tracked for all of the different targets. These are all of the targets here, and then all of the initiatives. Give you a view of what some of those look like. These are some of the 160, and you see some of the ones that we just looked at in the last section on equity. One of the things that's going to get tracked is, in terms of the projects, how far along are they? Are they underway? And if they are, how far along are they? And you can see down here that there are 169 different projects that are being tracked. One of the things that's being done, I'll show you what one of these looks like over here, is that the stakeholders who are actually managing this work are able to put information directly into the system, so that someone out in the field at the Philadelphia Housing Development Corporation, which is this organization doing weatherization, or someone from the fleet management organization, the Department of Fleet Management, will be able to put in their data directly and have it tracked in those kinds of graphs that we see there. So the information is available to them for their own work, as well as part of what you see in the plan. And as time goes on, when more and more people do that, what takes place is that the information is looked at against a lot of different metrics, and this one needs to be a little more populated, but you can see that we're tracking cost, we're tracking the metric tons of equivalent carbon dioxide, greenhouse gases in other words, the different metrics that are attached to the homes themselves, increasing the number of homes that are getting done, the baseline, the energy use in MMBTUs, new jobs, renewable production, and then the satisfaction with these things. So as time goes on and more information is put into the system, it will really grow each of these different sections, and you'll be able to see the data really coming alive, and you'll be able to tell based on things like the objective how well different projects are doing. How close are we to 100,000 homes? So that's the kind of work that is taking place right now to not just implement the plan, but also to keep track of it over a long period of time. The Greenworks database. One of the questions that deserves an answer is, why wouldn't there be equity to begin with? The city is more than 200 years old. It is a place that has a long history of growth and development. It's the city of brotherly love. What created this modern situation of inequity? Is it things like the slave trade and the fact that there were folks that came from the South to work in the North after being freed? Is it education? Is it crime? If we take a historical perspective, is it that there were jobs here, but now there aren't jobs? What took place? One of the ways that we can begin to answer that is by looking into history and trying to figure out these kinds of things, and seeing what situations grew up over time that would be causing a lack of equity. And this is a map that was done in 1932. It's part of what's called a redlining map. And redlining was the practice of filling out these kinds of forms, making color-coded maps like you see, to provide information on where loans should or should not be given in a particular area. And so you can see here the name of the city, the security grade, it's gotten a low security grade and a D, what area, it's nice and level. This is for an area near Philadelphia University. And so what's favorable about it? It's got a good shopping area on Lehigh and Germantown Avenue, fairly close to a commercial area, good transportation. What are the detrimental influences? Well, there's obsolescence, some Negro and some foreign. That's very strange. Why would that matter in terms of these things? Well, for whatever reason, the federal government in the 30s decided that that was something that should be examined very closely so that you could begin to get a better idea of where property values were and where they might be headed. And it's a horrible racist thing. It's something that actually created a lack of equity then and continues to create equity now. You heard Majora Carter talk about redlining in New York. It took place in Philadelphia. It took place all over the country. And so they looked at what people did, how much money they made, whether they were foreign born, whether they were black, how many infiltration of relief families, people who were on welfare, was taking place, and whether population was going up and down. And so a lot of this looks like a standard government form, but a lot of it unfortunately was essentially an inventory of disadvantaged people or people of color, and they were being examined so that banks, which were run by white Americans, would not make loans in those particular areas. And so a little more of the form here. What all of this was built up into are more detailed redlining maps. And I'm going to show you a couple of what those maps look like here. This is South Philadelphia in the map, and if we begin to examine it a little more closely, let me crunch it down a little bit here, make sure that we really can't see it. If we begin to zoom into South Philadelphia, you see some of the different markings that they've made on this particular map. The reason why it was called redlining is that there were these red lines everywhere. These letter grades correspond to the D that you saw, but this one is actually from a little bit later than when that form was made, and so there are things like DE, but this is a pretty bad area. If you're getting a D or an E, it's essentially a failing grade. And then there are these hash marks, and there are these green, and there are these blue, and it's actually a pretty sophisticated way to describe all of the different immigrants and different races, different makeups of these neighborhoods in a way that people could essentially not put their investment somewhere where they were concerned that there would be negative influences, what they saw as negative influences at that point in time. So you see the racial concentrations here: Jewish, Italian, colored. Conspicuous nationalities are also noted: Polish, Lithuanian. I can zoom this in a little more. Sorry, I'm trying to zoom it out. There we go. Conspicuous nationalities, of course, the Germans are very conspicuous, Lithuanians and Polish as well. And then those letters that we saw, the grades essentially that were given to these different neighborhoods, are here as well in the location ratings. And so you can see what those look like. high-class residential, which of course also means white. White isn't actually noted on the map. It's just assumed that any place that is not one of the things that we saw earlier, Jewish, Italian, or African American, is a white neighborhood. So you almost don't need to call that out. It's just this absence here. And then upper middle class, lower working class, and my favorite, which is decadent. That decadent behavior is something that you should stay away from. And I'm not exactly sure what decadent behavior meant at that point in time, but it's probably that they pictured that there were speakeasies and brothels and things like that, basically on every street corner. And there's a high correlation between, of course, the racial makeup as they've defined it of these neighborhoods and the level of decadence. And then there are these intermediate grades. So they've created a pretty sophisticated system, and then they've got other marks in the legend here that tell you about different characteristics: offices, heavy industrial. So this is sort of the view of the world in 1934 as far as the people who were investing in these areas. But we can also use this map not just to investigate sort of the I don't know, intellectual, I don't know, the way that they were thinking, and how little they actually took time to investigate the communities that they were looking at on any other lines than just these racial and economic lines. But we can also use this to try to tell us a little bit more about where things stand today. So let's take a look at a neighborhood here. Let's look down in here and see how those different markings are actually applied. So we've got a point here. We're in kind of North Philadelphia here, and zoom out just a little bit. So this is Roosevelt Boulevard, which is Route 1, major thoroughfare at that time, still a major thoroughfare today, and some pretty negative marks on the map here, some red marks that are showing that probably these houses should not be invested in at all, even though the neighborhoods themselves might not be that bad. And then you see that it's, I think that this was the marking for predominantly Jewish neighborhoods, and then there was more Jewish sort of inhabitants that were moving into these other neighborhoods here. So this is, we need a park in this whole area. And then we get over here, and even more redlining going on. We've got more of D's and C's and E's. So it gives you a sense of how detailed they were about going block to block. I'm just going to go back to the form for just a quick second. Look down here at the bottom about where the information comes from, and there's just a single name given here. And one of the things that always makes me curious about these forms is how deep they really dug in order to get this information. It looks very detailed, it looks very official when you take a look back at a map like this or a map like this, but did they just rely on Harry Heidelberger, or were they truly doing an economic and a block-by-block survey? It's sort of hard to tell. So we'll take a look at this neighborhood kind of near where we are at Philadelphia University, right around Roosevelt Boulevard, in a couple of different ways right now. This is the first, is just by looking at it in terms of the map itself and what's going on with the map. But we'll take a look at it in a modern tool. This is something called the Philadelphia Neighborhood Information System, and we'll try to kind of compare that map with a more modern map. And they've got a great set of information here. This is a product of a group of people who do mapping related work at the University of Pennsylvania here in Philadelphia, trying to combine data sets onto maps to give you a lot more information about what's going on, what's taking place in the neighborhoods, what's taking place in terms of ownership, crime, and the great mural project that we have here in the city. Let's take a look at crime. We can begin to ask ourselves, well, what's really how can we see the indications of redlining today? If we look at this particular area on the map, what are we likely to see? What impact did the lack of investment from way back in 1934 have on people not only then, but today? So let's see if we can see that. Let's pick a good landmark here. Again, we've got a good amount of activity here. We have a couple of different landmarks that we can use. Let's see if we can get something really good. So there's Juanita Park down here. See if we can key in on that. Greenwood Cemetery and Oakland Cemetery as well. So we'll see if we can get this same kind of area, which is really one of the worst in terms of residential, more suburban neighborhoods on the map, and match them up one to another. So from this, what we can do is get the maps from the NII's database. They have an incredible amount of historic and longitudinal activity going on. We can look at it in all of these different ways. It almost doesn't matter what we pick here, since we're just looking at the whole area, but we'll choose by neighborhoods just to mark it out by neighborhoods, and then we can pick how severe the crimes are. Aggravated assaults are the street assaults. Auto thefts are obviously stealing cars. Burglaries are people breaking into houses. Robberies are other kinds of people being robbed that may or may not correlate with assault. Then there's theft, and there's general census data in here as well. We will go to aggravated assaults. That seems like probably the most severe people really doing person-on-person crime. We can begin to see all of these different data points, standard ones with guns, at schools, rate, robberies, etc. You can actually go through all of the different ones. We'll assume that people assaulting one another with guns in the neighborhood is going to be a good indicator of how bad things are in the different neighborhoods that we've got, and the ones that we're going to be looking at here. So this purple line right here is Roosevelt Boulevard, so very close to what we're looking at. Let's see if on both maps we can try to find this dip, because this neighborhood right here is the one where there's the highest incidence of aggravated assaults. Oh, I'm sorry, I picked with no guns. I'm going to go back and fix that. Do with guns. So roughly the same data. Again, we've got Roosevelt Boulevard here. We've got this big dip in it. Let's see if we can match the dip on both pieces. I'm pretty sure that dip is this dip, but let's take a look. Roosevelt Boulevard hasn't moved around. It's basically the same place. So here's Frankfurt. We'll look at the same Frankfurt neighborhood in both maps. Sort of zoom in on that. Again, we had information here, C's, D's. So this is an area that, according to the map at least, is essentially on the decline. The B's are up over here, the C's and D's are over here, but there are a lot of different shadings that would indicate on this map that it's not a good area for investing. You get the red homes here; those are dangerous as well. So a lot of flags coming up about putting money in this particular area. So we'll zoom in on that little dip there. Same spot. We have our key over here. This is our dip. This is the neighborhood essentially that we're looking at in both areas, and you can see that it's a very high crime rate, that they're in each of these different areas. According to the key, we've got 70 to 180 aggravated assaults with guns in this particular area, and it's a fairly remarkable correlation between the two, between a lot of redlining taking place back then and a lot of crime taking place now. Essentially, the money that came out of this particular neighborhood as a result of the work that was done by the federal government in 1934 shows up today, 70 years later, and that we can see that people are assaulting one another with guns, unfortunately, in this area at a very high rate, almost the highest in the city. Um, it's all the way on the upper end of the chart here. So just one example of how long-term policy, that certain policies uh, can have very long-term effects, and also a good way that we can use data and use maps to investigate that more thoroughly. We can do the same kinds of things with migrations, north-south migrations or south-north migrations in different databases. You can use a census database to show how different populations moved after the Civil War up into the north and how they dispersed across the country. And then you can also use databases like this or like something called Policy Map from the Reinvestment Fund to take a look at education everywhere, property values, different kinds of demographic data, so that you can get a much better view of what's going on than you might get in other kind of mapping systems. Not that there's not value in those other mapping systems, but you've got really good overlays of information that are coming from these kinds of systems. So, not a lot of equity in redlining, and now we've got to create systems and plans and spend a lot of money to correct that. It becomes more expensive to do as time goes on as well. If it had been corrected back then, it would have been much simpler than trying to fix it now through things like Greenworks Philadelphia, other kinds of investments. So it's a shame. Redlining is really a bad chapter in our nation's history. This is what I was talking about in terms of policy map. This is another tool that you can use to take a look at neighborhoods. In terms of repairing neighborhoods, another tool that we have a little more universal than something like the Greenworks plan is LEED for neighborhood development. This is a little pixelated, but you can see that when architects and planners begin to think about how to create equity, what they do is they come up with a sustainability scoring system like LEED, which is put out by the U.S. Green Building Council, or the USGBC. LEED stands for Leadership in Environmental and Energy Efficient Design. And for this particular scorecard, you can get 110 possible points. Being well situated with public transportation can score you a total of 27 points. The design of the neighborhood itself can get you 44 points. Greening up your infrastructure and your buildings can get you 29 points. And then you can get 10 bonus points for some combination of innovation design processes and regional priority credits. I won't spend too much time on this. This was part of the reading, looking at all of these different parts of this, but the intent overall is to essentially design in equity in these different areas to make sure that people have access to jobs, to natural resources, to neighborhood resources, and green infrastructure, so that there is increased equity, so that we're sure that there's enough for everyone in these spaces. Correlates very closely to some of the things that we read in the reading by Dunham-Jones and by Williams, in terms of really moving from a very kind of grid and block-tied point of view to a much more holistic point of view, where you're thinking about all of these things in a way that you can create equity by design as much as possible. So as with the Greenworks plan, the question is, will this work? Is this enough? Can you actually create neighborhoods that meet these kinds of standards, and will they actually create equity once you've done that? Is it something that truly can take place, or is this really just a top-down exercise or an academic exercise that isn't going to yield the kinds of results that people want? It's an open question. So it's good to look at these scorecards in a fair amount of detail and kind of step through what you can get credits for. If you're a professional who's thinking about doing this work, of course you can get certified and become a lead ND designer if you'd like to. So will it include equity in the neighborhoods? And if not, what else would be needed? What else could we do as architects and designers, sustainability professionals, in order to go beyond lead ND and create more equity in the future? The next unit is on slums. This is a slum in Indonesia, outside Jakarta. This is sort of the traditional view that a lot of people have of what disadvantaged people in third world countries live in, that there's this horrible state of squalor. We did a lot of reading from Planet of Slums and Mike Davis, challenging our notions and reconfirming our notions about slums. One of the things that we tend to talk about a lot in the program is, can you really be doing a great job in sustainability if you're just thinking about it in your own backyard or in the United States and not thinking more globally about sustainability? And then also how to create equity between the haves in places like the United States, where we're creating a lot of the pollution and a lot of the greenhouse gas emissions, consuming a lot of the resources, but we're rich, and the have-nots, where they really don't have a lot and would like to get more, would like to be able to consume more resources, but now that we've realized that there are a finite set of resources and that there's global warming, how do we create parity among those two different desires? Our desire in the United States to have all of these things and keep them, and the desire of folks in developing countries to get them, while at the same time not completely tearing apart the environment and creating a climate change catastrophe all at the same time. So it's important to actually really understand what that means and how people in developing countries can be treated equitably. What are some of the ways of doing that? To do that, really, first you have to sort of go in and begin to understand these areas in a lot more detail. So when Mike Davis talks about slums, he talks about them being an amalgam of dilapidated houses, overcrowding, disease, poverty, and vice. And that's kind of the 19th century view. Back then, those liberals thought that the moral dimension was decisive, not a lot different than what we just saw in the redlining example. And if Islam was first and foremost envisioned as a place where an incorrigible feral social residuum rots in a moral riotous splendor. Excuse me, slums. That shouldn't say Islam. It should say slums. And if slums were first and foremost envisioned as a place where an incorrigible and feral social residuum rots in immoral and often riotous splendor. It was sort of the very old view. So this is the slightly more modern view, contemporary with the redlining exercise that we just saw folks doing back in the 1930s. But what they say is that we need to actually, in this particular document, they talk about just getting rid of the slums, going through and actually raising slums and figuring out how to create situations that would be much more conducive for the economy, for education, for health conditions, by essentially central planning. Not a lot different from Greenworks, not a lot different from Lead ND in their current times, in 1934 U.S. Federal policy. So what do you do? The present manuscript sets forth in convincing manner the great need for slum clearance and rehousing of the low-income groups, discussing the housing conditions in various large cities, setting the various surveys conducted, and pulling them together with the data secured, showing the importance of the manner. So the kinds of maps that we just looked at really are a product of that kind of thinking. We need to get rid of them, and redlining maps could be used for that purpose, as well as moving the investment toward the places that, if they weren't cleared, were likely to represent places where you could actually get a return on the investment that you'd made. and unfortunately those were essentially white upper and middle class areas. Um, so what does the term slum mean? Um, the view of UN Habitat is that the term slum includes the traditional meaning housing areas that were once respectable or even desirable, which have deteriorated and the original developers have moved to new and better areas of cities. The condition of the old houses has then declined and the units have progressively subdivided and been rented out to lower income groups. A typical example is the inner city slums of many historical towns and cities in both the industrial and developing countries. The term slum, however, has come to include also the vast informal settlements that are quickly becoming the most visual expression of urban poverty. The quality of dwellings in such settlements varies from the simplest shack to permanent structures, while access to water, electricity, sanitation, and other basic services and infrastructure tends to be limited. Such settlements are referred to by a wide range of names and include a variety of tenurial arrangements, tenurial being what Hernando de Soto was talking about in The Mystery of Capital, tenure rights and property rights. And we'll see that it's not just all of these things, unfortunately, that they're talking about that create a slum, but also things like a lack of a government presence, that the police, the fire departments, healthcare workers, other government entities are not actually going into the slums. There are essentially no-fly zones for government workers, and they'd much rather stay away, pretend that these things do not exist. This is coupled with the fact that a lot of the folks who are inhabiting slums don't have any kind of documentation to prove that they're in good standing in different areas in terms of things like being married or even that they're eligible for jobs. And so those situations are perpetuating themselves in slums as a result of the government not being present. And it's also very difficult for someone who is essentially an undereducated and very low income individual to take part in a city bureaucracy, especially one that's outside their neighborhood, and begin to get the documentation that they need to prove that they're married, to prove that they're eligible to work, even to prove that they're eligible to vote. And being disadvantaged essentially becomes a perpetual state that it's very difficult to get out of. So not only do you have all of these difficult housing situations, but you also have a citizenship problem that goes along with it. So here are some examples of modern slums and what they look like. These are all ones that we read about in the Planet of Slums. This is what slums look like in Nigeria. These are the houses that they were talking about, where there are probably 12 or 14 folks in each of these different dwellings that are essentially, they're called rack houses. The people are being rented to by slumlords, whether it's individuals who own the houses or landlords. But all of these people, all of these houses actually represent only a fraction of the number of inhabitants who are actually here. They're almost each like small hotels in this particular area. Here's what things look like in Brazil. We're actually going to go visit this neighborhood and a neighborhood nearby it in a couple of minutes. But if you look back at the UN example about how things are dilapidated, you can see some examples here and here, over here, where essentially the dwellings have fallen in on themselves. And you can imagine that a lot of other ones are being held up really by spit and glue, that they're in danger of falling apart. Obviously, overcrowding is an incredible problem here. The only way to move is through these tiny little slits. You can see that there really aren't a lot of wires visible anywhere. Obviously, there aren't any streets, and so there isn't a whole lot of sewage that's available. So not only is the government not likely to be present in a place like this, but you really don't have basic sanitation and utilities as well. This is Lima, Peru. This was also in the reading. This is one of the areas that's not only got dilapidated housing and very high density of population within each of these different houses, but this entire area runs up a hill. And so there are actual tenements here, and then there are floods that will take place down the hill. Mike Davis in Planet of Slums talks a lot about how the poor tend to inhabit areas that are very risky, that there's a combination not only of the fragility of the houses themselves and the weakness of those houses, but that there are in sites where they're likely to uh, really be in the path of a lot of different dangerous activity like floods, mudslides, or chemical processing. And this is really an example of what you see here, that there will be floods that actually come and wipe out houses from time to time in this whole area, and that's probably why, that's partly why it's not built up much in this area. It's because this is kind of a flood basin that's right here. And these are workers' houses in and township houses in South Africa. This situation is actually made to look a little bit better because the satellite came through, and for whatever reason the satellite imagery tried to color a lot of these different spots as being more green than they are. Don't 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 think that those are actually trees. They're basically just dirt holes that happen to be colored green. Um, but the same kind of situation exists here. You can see that the roads aren't paved. There aren't any major facilities. There aren't any things that would be, for example, recreation centers uh, or clinics or things like that. These are just houses that have essentially been pieced together out of whatever could be found in the area and put together so that people had a place as a base to go and seek jobs. We'll talk more about tenure security later as well, but people who live here do not actually own these properties. They don't own the rights to live there, to be in their houses. And so someone also has to be home all the time. And very often that tends to be the children, so that mom, for example, can go and do the shopping while dad's at work, and the child stays home and watches the house. Unfortunately, the child can't also go to school because they're essentially being a security guard. So there are a lot of different layers of difficulty that are wrapped up in these places. So these are kind of the worst of the worst. And you can see some of the similarities, some of the differences among them, but it's an international problem. There are people who want to go to urban spaces to get jobs, and unfortunately, there aren't enough houses for them. And these are the kinds of places that result. So let's take a look at one of those in a little more detail. This is the picture that we saw in the last slide, but now we're actually in Google Maps, and we can zoom out and begin to apply our definition of slum. One of the things about not having tenure security is that you're at risk of redevelopment, and that's really what you see over here, is that in that spot and then also down here, these different favelas, which are part of this particular slum, have been completely taken away. And you can see these nice geometric cuts that were done to take those out. And if you take a look over here, there's this really probably basically just a runoff kind of stream here that's carrying waste from uphill. This is pretty close to the rivers in Rio. Basically just taking raw open sewage downstream. A lot of garbage is gathered here. And then right across, Mike Davis talks quite a bit about this, you begin to see a hazard zone in terms of a combination of what looks like waste processing in these areas here, whether it's wastewater itself or some sort of chemical processing, or possibly a mix of the two. Can't really tell from up here. I tried to look it up and I couldn't tell exactly what this plant is, but it's a pretty big plant. Not the kind of place that you'd necessarily want to be putting your house right next to if you had any other option. And you're, as Mike Davis talks about, often marginalized and sandwiched in between all of these different places geographically, like major roads and really pretty unpleasant looking rivers on both sides, and so you're sort of hemmed in as well. There's not a lot of freedom of movement outside this particular area. So this is one of the really worst slums, one of the oldest slums in downtown Rio. And you can kind of go up the hill here to the left and see a very similar kind of situation. This is a slightly newer slum nearby. Seems to be a better place. Is not quite as hemmed in. There's actually a little more greenery going on here. This is a college or a university that's right here. You can see that they have some of these bigger buildings that represent more of an institutional infrastructure. This one is a rec center. This one over here is a school. So this slum is sort of matured out of the very new raw state into something else. And you can also see these bigger passageways that have been built in here so that you can get goods and vehicles in and out of the fields a little better. One of the really neat things that I like about this is that you can actually get down on the ground and take a look at what's going on. So let's go do that in a couple of different places. I think that this challenges our notion of what slums can be, even though these meet a lot of the criteria of Mike Davis's definition or the UN Habitat definition. You begin to get a better sense that it's not as horrible as what was going on necessarily down the hill or in some of the places like that first photo that we saw in Indonesia. But you still see quite a lot of things that are surprising in this area. There really is not a lot of infrastructure here. You can see that people are basically hijacking the utilities, even though there are utilities here. There is quite a lot of tapping of the lines going on. Not a lot of trash pickup, probably not a lot of sewage or drainage going on, but on the other hand, a fairly middle class kind of existence that's possible within this particular neighborhood. So I was going to go back to another example here as well. Of a different picture, more of a kind of back alley picture. These pictures, when they were taken, were actually tagged with their location so that you knew exactly where they were, and that's how they're showing up in these different places on the map. So still a lot of electricity work being done basically by pulling lines from one location to another. Not the most secure place, but relatively clean. There is some sewer access here, but still a lot of indicators on the buildings of different security precautions that are being taken place. So probably not the safest neighborhood, even though you've got kids playing out here. One of the things that you miss when you don't have governments who are helping you out are things like building code enforcement, occupancy enforcement, and so you see over here that there are a lot of kind of shabby things that have been put together to make these different buildings that may or may not be safe. And it's pretty universal. I don't know if they talk about it in Planet of Slums or somewhere else, but these particular blocks that are in these buildings are almost universal now in these more established slums, that they've really figured out how to make these blocks very quickly, very inexpensively, out of a lot of different standard kind of materials that are available, and they're able to press out hundreds if not thousands of them to very quickly put up these houses. So this particular slum is a little more mature, more attractive looking, and wouldn't necessarily be the worst place in the world to be. So challenging our notion a bit of what a slum is and how they can mature over time. So the next video, which is being shown a little bit on the screen right here, is actually a soap opera that is filmed in and around the slums of Rio de Janeiro, the kinds of places that we were just living. It's called City of Men. It's almost a docudrama of two little boys who are growing up in the favelas and the experiences that they have. It's all shot on location using kids who are and adults who are residents there, and gives you a little bit of the flavor of how the houses are made and the different kinds of things that might be going on in any given day in this area. So I'll let you take a look at that next.